Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of Dr. Sayers Teaches Something. Today we're going to be talking about the state of Franklin, an attempt to create an independent state, or a 14th United State, in what is now Upper East Tennessee, in the 1780s. Now, the background for this is that during the 1600s, when the King of England and other European governments were granting land to different colonies in North America, many of those colonies had overlapping land claims. And furthermore, many of them had land claims going all the way to what in the 1600s they called the South Seas, by which they probably meant the Pacific Ocean. And so, when the United States declared independence from Great Britain, many of those claims were not yet fully resolved. A number of states claimed land claimed by other states as well, and some claimed land running at least to the Mississippi River, where the claims to the South Seas had been cut short following the French and Indian War. But during the Revolutionary War, as the 13 states created the Articles of Confederation, they agreed, more or less, to give up their claims to land west of the Appalachian Mountains for the benefit of the Continental Congress. That would make the largest states, such as Virginia, less large relative to, say, Rhode Island or Delaware, and would provide a source of revenue for Congress, who could sell off that land to make some money. Congress not having much of a way to raise money otherwise, as it could request money from the states but could not impose taxation upon them. And one by one, the various states with western land claims began giving most of it up. And in 1784, North Carolina, which claimed to the Mississippi River, voted to give up their claims west of the Appalachian Mountains to Congress. For one thing, the people there wanted roads and courthouses, and wanted their own brigade of militia to defend themselves from the Indians and possibly take their land as well. And North Carolina didn't really want to pay for these things, and was kind of trying to play along, to be a good neighbor to the other states, give up western land claims as most others had done. They voted to do this, and the state legislature went home. Congress made no immediate effort to vote on the cession of land by North Carolina. And when North Carolina's delegates in Congress saw the terms of the offer, they wrote back home to the state legislature and said, "Are you all stupid? You just gave this land up for nothing." Whereas a number of other states had given up their land with strings attached. Massachusetts, for example, had a large part of its share of the Revolutionary War debt canceled in exchange for the land it gave up. It's true that a lot of the best land in North Carolina had recently been sold off, mostly to large land speculators under the so-called Land Grab Act, passed by North Carolina shortly before they gave up their land. But nonetheless, North Carolina's delegates in Congress thought their state could have gotten a better deal, and they encouraged North Carolina to retract their offer before Congress could vote on it, which North Carolina ultimately did. But that meant there was a period of several months, in late 1784 and early 1785, when there wasn't really any government overseeing in what is now Upper East Tennessee, or for that matter was now Middle Tennessee. But they largely did their own thing in what they called the Miro District, named after Governor Miro down in New Orleans, the Spanish governor of Louisiana, who was seen by many in Middle Tennessee as someone more important to curry favor with than anybody east of the Appalachian Mountains. So the people in what is now Upper East Tennessee had a number of meetings in Jonesboro and elsewhere to decide what to do, and decided that without a government overseeing them, they would have to create one of their own, and created what they called the state of Franklin, in hopes of currying favor with the great natural philosopher Benjamin Franklin, who later, I'm sorry to say, claimed to be honored, but have no idea this had been done for him, and did not throw his influence behind the state of Franklin. And having decided to create a new state, they had to create a new government. A small group, led by Presbyterian minister Samuel Houston, whose famous nephew of the same name would later be governor of Tennessee and Texas, and Reverend Samuel Doak, and some others as well, came up with, by the standards of the day, a very liberal and democratic constitution, opening voting up to almost all free men, which would have included free black men. It would have required public education from elementary schools all the way up to a state college. It would have prevented lawyers and ministers and many other community leaders from being part of the government, so as, I guess, not to distract them from their work. Ultimately, this plan failed. For one thing, some of the biggest land speculators worried, I think, that they would lose some of their influence under this system. There were some other criticisms as well, as it did have some religious requirements for holding public office. Fairly innocuous ones by the standards of the day. Pretty much any Protestant Christian would have qualified, but there were some who perhaps were opposed to that as well. And so they pretty quickly slapped together something else, largely based on the Constitution of North Carolina, and that split the supporters of the young state from the start. And some decided to rather support North Carolina after all. And then, once North Carolina took back the cession and did promise to create a militia brigade and some of the other things the people of western North Carolina had wanted, some other people in Franklin decided they would rather remain loyal to North Carolina as well. But North Carolina had to deal with a new government in Franklin. And with a new constitution, such as it was, they elected a governor, John Sevier, a famous Indian fighter and hero of the Battle of Kings Mountain in the Revolutionary War, and a large land speculator. They elected a state legislature, but they even elected a delegate to Congress, William Cock, to kind of lobby for Franklin's admission to statehood. There was a plan to create a currency for Franklin, but no coins were ever minted, no paper money was ever printed. There were standards for various furs to be used as currency. Governor Sevier was largely paid in deer skins, for example. There are legends, at least, of currency being counterfeited, of people paying their taxes with big bundles of possum pelts that had a few raccoon pelts tied around the outside and a bunch of raccoon tails cut off and sewn to the possum pelts inside. So the tax collectors counted up the tails and assumed they were all actually full-fledged raccoon pelts. So some counterfeiting, even without coins or paper money. There was a commission to design a flag, which never designed a flag, which is really not that unusual. Very few states actually had a flag at that point. That became much more popular, really during the Civil War, and indeed not really till the late 18 or early 1900s would most states have a flag. Tennessee's current flag was designed around the turn of the 20th century by a National Guard colonel from Johnson City. Now, you'll sometimes see a supposed flag of Franklin flying here and there, but it looks pretty much like the modern Tennessee flag, but with a big green F in place of the 3 stars and the rondelle in the middle. So I rather have my doubts that was actually flown by John Sevier. There was a law passed to create a great seal for the state of Franklin, but that was never made. They sealed things with a wafer, which was basically a circle of glue. Nonetheless, this new government did create laws and courts and land registration for the people living in Franklin. It was a genuine attempt by the people here to create a government of their own. And one it would turn out they badly needed, because not only would the North Carolina government try to regain control of the territory by appointing their own local officials, so that there was competing Franklin and North Carolina courts and sheriffs and tax collectors, although both states began forgiving taxes to people who promised to be loyal to those states. Sometimes members of one state would even break up the courts of the other state, making it hard to get business done. Many of the records from this time were lost, as some were burned or otherwise destroyed. Some were hidden in caves for protection, but then got ruined by the dampness. It was North Carolina trying to re-establish authority in Franklin. But the U.S. government, at least some members of it, began to actively work against Franklin as well. Now, after the Revolutionary War, the United States had to build diplomatic and trade relations with all the countries of the world. And one of the most problematic was the Kingdom of Spain, which had technically sided with the United States during the Revolutionary War, but that was to help out their cousins, the King of France, and despite Britain. With some success, Spain got Florida back from Britain after the Revolutionary War, having lost it to them during the French and Indian War. But Spain wanted to discourage Western settlement by Americans, for fear that America would overwhelm Spain's claims in the southeastern U.S., which encompassed all of Florida and the rest of the Gulf Coast, and arguably up to the southern part of what is now Tennessee. The Spanish were building a fort close to modern-day Memphis in the early 1790s. And so the Spanish, who did still control Louisiana and the Mississippi River, having been given that by the French after the French and Indian War to make up for the loss of Florida, closed off trade on the Mississippi River to Americans. And for many people living west of the Appalachian Mountains, at a time when roads were very poor, the Mississippi River was a very important trade route. People living in, say, what is now Upper East Tennessee, might load furs or other goods they wanted to sell up on a flatboat, sail it down their local river, the Holston or the Watauga or the Nolichucky, eventually to the Tennessee River, from there to the Ohio River, from there to the Mississippi River, and then sell their goods in New Orleans, often chop up their boat and sell it for firewood, and then jog back home. And even though that trip might take well over a year, and they did risk disease and Indian attacks and land pirates in what is now Mississippi, this was still seen as more convenient than taking their goods back over the mountains. So cutting off Western trade was a serious problem for many Americans. Indeed, many officially swore loyalty to the King of Spain and got Spanish citizenship in order to trade in New Orleans. There was even a plot by a former and future U.S. Army officer, James Wilkinson, based in Kentucky, but secretly working for the King of Spain, to break what is now Kentucky away from Virginia and bring into the Spanish Empire, for which he took bribes from the Spanish for that and for other spying, off and on throughout his career, even when he was commanding general of the entire U.S. Army in the early 1810s. Spain even offered money, and we believe sent money, to John Sevier, governor of Franklin, in hopes of influencing him to bring Tennessee, or at least Franklin, into the Spanish Empire. As best we can tell, he took the money and spent it for the needs of the state, with no intention of joining the Spanish, which I think was the point of view of most of the Kentuckians who were taking some money alongside Wilkinson. Wilkinson himself, it's hard to tell. He's kind of a shadowy figure behind a lot of the wickedness in the late 1700s, early 1800s on the frontier. Recent speculation includes the possibility that he was behind the murder of Meriwether Lewis some years after the Lewis and Clark expedition. But the United States was, in the 1780s, negotiating with Spain. John Jay, future Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, was negotiating an agreement whereby Spain would open up many of their colonies to American trade, which was very desirable by many people in the northeastern United States. But in exchange, the U.S. would give up any claim to the use of the Mississippi River for 20 years, which was seen as a real betrayal by Westerners. And a number of Southerners were not particularly impressed either. The kind of trade that would go on between the United States and the Spanish Empire was seen as being mostly beneficial to the Northeast. So this Jay Treaty of 1785 was very unpopular and ultimately did not go through, but the mere threat of it and the long ongoing negotiations angered many Westerners, and a fair number of Southerners too. Furthermore, early in 1785, the state of Franklin had made a treaty, the Treaty of Dumplin Creek, with the Cherokee Indians, to expand Franklin's claims to the west, to encompass, for example, Greenville and Rogersville. Indeed, Greenville eventually became the capital of the state of Franklin. But a few months after that, the United States negotiated the Treaty of Hopewell with the Cherokee, in which the U.S. Drew a line between U.S. and Cherokee claims, which, among other things, put Greenville itself and a number of other Franklin settlements west of the treaty line, and thus outside the protection of the United States government, giving the Cherokee the legal right to attack and even kill anyone living west of the treaty line. Obviously a huge problem for Franklin. And furthermore, the state of Franklin's delegate to Congress, William Cock, was not having as much luck as he might have hoped. He actually got Congress to vote on recognizing Franklin as a 14th state, and 7 states, a majority, barely, of those in Congress, agreed to accept Franklin as a 14th state. But North Carolina abstained because they're an interested party. Virginia and, for some reason, Maryland voted against it. Massachusetts was also opposed. And, of course, Massachusetts had an independence movement of their own to deal with in the District of Maine. Virginia was worried about independence in the District of Kentucky. And they didn't want Franklin to set a dangerous example for their own frontier people. And while a majority may have voted to accept Franklin as a state, the way the Articles of Confederation work, it took a 2/3 majority, not a simple majority, to accomplish almost anything in Congress. And so Franklin never got to become a state. And while the governors of North Carolina did not make significant efforts to get Franklin back, the governor of Virginia was much more resolute. When people in southwestern Virginia, around what is now around Abingdon, tried to break away and become part of a greater Franklin. Governor Patrick Henry may have said, "Give me liberty or give me death," when he was opposing the British, but when fellow Virginians wanted independence, he threatened to march down and have them all executed. And so that potential ally for Franklin never really panned out, although the state of Georgia was supportive of Franklin. As the governor of Franklin, John Sevier, and the governor of Georgia, both had interests in colonizing the Great Bend of the Tennessee River, in what's now northern Alabama primarily, but was then claimed by Georgia. And together they wanted to work to defeat the Creek Indians living there and seize their land. Indeed, John Sevier led a major expedition there in late 1787. But while he was gone, the sheriff of Washington County, North Carolina, seized some of John Sevier's property, including a number of his slaves, for non-payment of North Carolina taxes, and took those slaves as prisoner to the home of John Tipton, in what's now the very southern part of Johnson City, Tennessee. Sevier went to try to recover his slaves, and in the so-called Battle of the Lost State of Franklin, culminating February 29th, 1788, John Sevier was defeated. 2 of his many sons were captured, and Tipton threatened to hang them. Reinforcements were approaching from Sullivan County to help out Tipton and his followers. And John Sevier was forced to back off, and that was also the last day of his 4-year term as governor. And so on March 1st, 1788, the state of Franklin pretty much came to an end, although in some areas west of the Hopewell Treaty line, people claimed to be operating under Franklin's authority into 1789, because nobody else was supporting them, clearly. John Sevier was later arrested, but escaped from jail in North Carolina, and would go on to be the first governor of Tennessee, once Tennessee became a state. And would be, I think, our second or third longest serving governor, serving almost 12 years in total. William Cock, Franklin's delegate to Congress, would be one of Tennessee's first 2 senators, the other being William Blount, a major land speculator who served as governor of the Southwest Territory, which was formed when North Carolina did give up their land a couple years later to the United States under the new U.S. Constitution. In many ways, the state of Franklin was practice for the state of Tennessee. And of many attempts to create new governments on the western frontier, it was the most successful one that didn't actually succeed, being less successful, obviously, than Kentucky or Maine's attempts to become states, but more successful, I suppose, than the settlers in the Wyoming Valley of northeastern Pennsylvania, many of whom had come from Connecticut and hoped to create their own state, or else become part of Connecticut itself, which led to years of warfare between those settlers and the government of Pennsylvania, eventually ending when Pennsylvania militia burnt out a lot of their farms, starving many of them in the winter in the 1780s. And the state of Franklin's interesting in its own right, I think, in kind of the overall history of the world, certainly in the history of Tennessee, but it also demonstrates just how divided the United States were early in our history. If you read the Federalist Papers or other things written during the debates around ratifying the Constitution, you'll see many people express fears that the United States, without a stronger government, might break up into 13 different countries, or a few different countries, or regional confederations, which might eventually go to war with one another. Looking back, that seems pretty far-fetched. But at the time, there were many forces potentially tearing the country apart. Even under the Constitution, while the Jay Treaty with Spain failed, there were a number of people in the East in the 1790s who wanted to slow or prevent Western settlement for fear that Western states might break away and form their own countries, which again may seem silly, but there was James Wilkinson kind of plotting for that up in Kentucky. There was an attempt by William Blount, again one of Tennessee's first two senators, to work with the British to secure more or less what's now northern Mississippi from the Spanish, mostly to protect his own land claims in the area. This resulted in Blount getting the distinction of being the first man expelled from the U.S. Senate. You'll sometimes hear he's the first senator to be impeached, but technically senators and congressmen can only be expelled, not actually impeached. That's a pretty technical matter. There was a plot by former Vice President Aaron Burr with James Wilkinson to break perhaps some of the southern United States based around New Orleans off from the United States, possibly invade and take over parts of northern Mexico as well, for which Aaron Burr was accused of treason and tried, but not executed. And this followed an earlier plot by Burr to possibly break New York State and New England away from the United States at a time when he was still Vice President of the United States and running for governor of New York. His unsuccessful campaign for governor being an important plot, a part of the plot to break New York and New England off from the United States. The failure of that campaign he blamed on Alexander Hamilton, which would not work out real well for Hamilton shortly after the election came to an end. And in the state of Franklin shows us an attempt that Frederick Jackson Turner would describe as the frontier creating democracy. And certainly an important event in the history of Tennessee, and I think an important event in the history of the United States as a whole. If that's something you'd like to learn more about, my own book on the subject, This United States, The Lost State of Franklin, and the Frontier State Movement at the Dawn of the American Republic, is currently out of print, but I do have a few sitting around the house someplace if you would like to buy a copy. I think you can also find it free on the internet a number of places.